All right, let's talk about Blake Corum of the Los Angeles Rams. An interesting player. So obviously the Rams need to have Kyron Williams. They don't need a running back, but let's be honest. When you have one running back, you don't have enough. Multiple running backs will play. I think Corum's a really interesting player, and I want to kind of talk about, how he will fit in this Rams scheme in general. If you don't know anything about Corum, we'll kind of talk about what he is as a player as we go along. This is going to be kind of half a film study of him and half a film study of how he fits with the Rams. So let's just get into it. Something like this play is a really, I think, important play in understanding what he is as a player. And this is something that Sean McVay loves out of running backs, where you see the running concept on the screen. Multiple players are supposed to get up to block linebackers at the next level. However, when this play begins, a third player who is kind of at the next level steps in and really covers up that area that if Corum wanted to run through, it's just not really available. However, if Corum wanted to run more towards the other side of the field, there's not really a window there either. So what do you do? Well, a lot of young running backs do try to bounce things to the outside. And, Corum's an older back for a college player. He's 23 years old, which is a big part of his, I think, negative, part of why he fell in the draft a little bit is because he's an older player. Although it's worth mentioning, he was really good last year too. So it's not like he was just only good because he's been in college for a while. But anyway, a lot of young players will try to do too much here. Corum doesn't. He puts his head down and takes the 2 yards that are there and basically accepts, okay, this isn't going to be a great play. But you know what? It wasn't a disaster either. They didn't lose a couple of yards. And while in a situation like this, that's not the biggest deal in the world, I think it can pay real dividends with other plays. Something like this. He's going to rush towards the offense's left, and you see the blocking concept towards that side of the field. That's how this is going to go. When this play begins, Corum takes the ball, and right here, you see that, trying to get through the gap, but there is a player to watch. That Alabama defender could rush over and make a play, and if Corum was a bit more of a cautious runner and maybe didn't quite follow his blockers as well, he might be being a little bit patient and not shooting through the gap as quickly, which could result in him getting tackled. However, Corum does get through the gap quickly, and they pick up a first down. I mean, Jim Harbaugh, I think, will probably tell you, okay, we call plays well enough to get a gap open most of the time. We don't want you to, do too much reading the play and stuff like that. Do some, of course, but don't overthink things here. Usually the gap we want you to run through is going to be a good gap to run through. Sean McVay's the same way in a lot of respects. I want to be clear on what I'm saying. There are zone plays. There are plays where your running back has to read the play and all of that. I'm just saying, usually doesn't want you to overthink things and try to bounce things to the outside, try to do too much. Because, usually when it's, hey, either option A or B is going to be open, he doesn't want you trying for option C too often. But there's also stuff like this that I think Corum really brings to the table, where this is going to be a rush towards the top of the screen. Corum is in motion right here. That Alabama player should eventually be able to run over and make a tackle, but it should be a minute before that happens, right? So you should have some time to get over there, hopefully gain some yards. And when this play begins, you're going to see that is pretty much what happens. Corum is able to get closer towards the top of the screen right here. There is an Alabama player that I mentioned earlier who can try to get over and make a tackle, but you've already gained some yards. But here's the thing about Corum. I know he's not a big guy. Again, if you don't know anything about him, that's kind of the main reason why he fell is the athleticism and the the size isn't overly impressive with him. He's a smaller player, 5'8", 213, and also isn't someone who's a combine monster either. But he doesn't need that here when he runs over that Alabama player. And the reality is, you wouldn't know it by watching the tape. And there is some logic behind, sometimes just draft a good player. Yeah, sure, it does happen that there are guys who are good, players in college, but once you get to the NFL level where there's just better athletes, your athleticism can't hang with them. That is a thing that happens. But the Rams kind of have the mindset of, we're going to draft good players and it's going to work out more often than it's not. As for blocking, if you know me, blocking is something I really do harp on. And listen, I'm not going to sit here and say Corum is a great blocker. I'm not. Again, he is someone who, he's a smaller guy. There's only going to be so much you can do in those situations. That being said, watch on this play how he is able to get in position and, again, do what he can. Gets in the way of the player who is blitzing and allows his quarterback to get the snap off. That's all you need to do. He's usually pretty good at getting in position to block. He will get ran over sometimes. It is what it is. But I think you'd probably rather the guy who can read these plays well and get in position than the guy who can't, just get in position at all, even if they're a better, more physical player, because at least with Corum, you're slowing the other guy down, even if you're not stopping him. There's also plays like this where, going to be, you have several players moving up to the next level to block players. That's kind of the key thing to know pre-snap. And when it begins, it's working out well. They do get those players at the next level, well blocked. This is really, there's a clear window. And this is what you like about Corum, I think, is, yes, all that stuff I just mentioned is very good. But I think his maybe number one trait is what he was able to do when there were well-blocked plays. We sometimes spend too much time talking about what do you do as a running back in bad situations, when the reality is, in bad situations, it's not going to be a great play either way. What you want is, what do you do when you're in good situations? And watch as Corum is able to shoot through that gap quickly, but he also adjusts really well while on the move. So right here, he's already looking to be in a pretty good situation, but you're going to see him be able to run by those players as well. And even at this point where, he could easily just step out of bounds. In fact, when you're watching it live, you're almost expecting him to step out of bounds, but that's just not what Corum does. Instead, he's going to cut things back towards the middle a little bit, but then run more towards down the sideline. Eventually does get tackled. But again, he can do some really good stuff in open space. The reality is, he's a good player. So yeah, at the end of the day, again, there is always that debate, and people are kind of always going to disagree on what do you do? Do you draft the player who is just good, or do you draft a player who maybe isn't quite as good at the college level, but has more physical tools and you think could be better, especially at a position like running back, which is so dependent on your physicality, right? Obviously, those physical traits just matter so much. And usually you would assume that they're going to be the same, right? The better player is going to be the better athlete. And, that's typically how it works. But I think you can easily make the counter argument and well, if the better athlete is usually the better player, why wasn't that the case in college? Maybe you can find a guy who is a better athlete than Corum at the college level, but why weren't they a better player than Corum at the college level, right? And it's because Corum does a lot of nice little things and is still a good athlete himself, right? Obviously, there's that. It's really more the size that's kind of the biggest issue with him, more so than athleticism, but it's kind of the age-old discussion. Corum isn't my favorite prospect, and I do think it's fair to say the Rams didn't desperately need a running back, but this is also part of the value of the Rams having so many draft picks, is they can afford to take chances on guys like this, and they're not really asking Corum to come in and be like a star. That's not really what they do with players like this. Usually they draft guys and say, can you be a contributor? Again, that's a key part of how the Rams won a Super Bowl, is, yes, they traded all these first-round picks for, star players, which was, a strategy that worked out pretty well. But the second half of it was they traded back so frequently, they got so many picks late in the draft, and used those picks on guys not trying to take big swings for the fences because they already had their stars, instead just trying to get contributors. And when they won the Super Bowl, there was a lot of late-round picks that were solid players that filled out the depth chart and were able to allow them to be a complete team, even though they had very few first-round picks. And Corum is another, guy in line with what the Rams tend to do. So those are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from ya. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.